Our fifth speaker for the 21st Annual Convention of the Catholic Biblical Association of the Philippines is Father Joel Camaya, SDB, PHL, SSL, MATH. Father Joel hails from Tarlac, Tarlac. He graduated BS Ed major in English and AB Philosophy at Don Bosco College, Canlubang, and Bachelor in Sacred Theology at the Don Bosco Center of Studies Parañaque and Salesian Pontifical University in Rome. He obtained his licentiate in philosophy from the Salesian Pontifical University in Rome, his licentiate in sacred scripture at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and his MA in theology at Don Bosco Center of Studies in Parañaque. At present, he is director of the religious community and president of the Don Bosco College, Canlubang. Father Joel is active in the media. During the 2015 People Visit, he was resource anchor for various television and radio stations, and he continues to be invited as resource person for religious issues. He teaches sacred scripture at Don Bosco School of Theology, Parañaque, and philosophy at Don Bosco College, Canlubang. As a young student of theology, Father Joel was a member of the Secretariat in the first CBAP Annual Convention in 2000 and at the preparatory meeting the year before. In 2017, he was elected to the CBAP board and chosen as president. He is ending his term in this convention. Here is Father Joel Camaya, SDB, to present his paper, The Hunter Snare and the Pestilence in Psalm 91.
Good morning, dear friends. My topic for this morning is the hunter snare and pestilence in Psalm 91. And I have divided my paper into 4 parts. The first one is the introduction, the use of Psalm 91 and the experience of the pandemic. 2, the text of Psalm 91. 3, Pach and Dever, the hunter snare and pestilence. And then 4, the conclusion, Psalm 91 in the time of pandemic. And I have chosen this process in exposing this topic, beginning with recognizing and then interpreting and choosing. Much of the papers that were presented were in this form. And I'd like to say that here are the parts. For the recognizing, we have this first part, introduction, and then the next 2 parts are for interpreting our experiences, and then the 4th part, this is the part of choosing, conclusion, Psalm 91 in the time of pandemic. So let's begin with this. So the use of Psalm 91 and the experience of the pandemic. You know, it's said that this psalm is one of the most read, one of the most preached on, and one of the best loved of all the psalms. The saints of all ages have turned to this psalm for comfort and strength. That's by R.E. Gingrich. And we see very obviously that Psalm 91 is found in the liturgy. The mention of Psalm 91 takes us to a very familiar plane, that is the liturgy. Before the revision of the Liturgy of the Hours, this was recited every night at Compline. And many monasteries have retained this practice to this day. When I was a novice, our novice master brought us to the Trappist monastery in Guimaras. For their night prayers, the monks ended each day with a Compline gathered around a soft glimmering light. And they sang their prayers by heart and with Psalm 91 sung in English, but in Gregorian chant. Psalm 91's place in the present Liturgy of the Hours is the Compline at the second Vespers of Sundays and solemnities. And then in the lectionary, Psalm 91 figures 3 times as a responsorial psalm. First, in the first Sunday of Lent, year C, the Sunday where we read about the temptation of Jesus as recounted by Luke, in which a part of the psalm is quoted in the gospel. And then 2 in the Monday of the 9th week in ordinary time, year 2. And then 3rd in the Monday of the 14th week in ordinary time, year 1. And here, in the last thing that I referred to, the response sums up a central message of Psalm 91. And the response is, "In you, my God, I place my trust." And the two readings, that is Genesis 28, 10 to 22, and then Matthew 9, verses 18 to 26, the readings of the day likewise highlight the same thing, of God's servants trusting in him, and he protecting his people and intervening in their affairs. Psalm 91 is a psalm that assures protection from the Lord, from the snare of the fowler, from deadly pestilence, from the terror of the night, and thus its place in the night prayer, from the arrow that flies by day, the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, the destruction that wastes at noon, from evil, from plague, etc. From plague, we are now witnesses to a pandemic. COVID-19 is in our midst. Dear friends, I'd like to share something. I work in a school, and this is my story, recognizing what is my story in this pandemic. And here's the school where I am rector. Our community also resides here. This is Don Bosco Canlubang. And once I was telling the young people under our care, in particular the graduating students, and this is batch 2020, this is their theme, Fortitudo etiam debilitas, strength even in weakness. And I told them, today is a day of thanksgiving. We thank God who has brought into completion what he has begun in you. It is the fruit of your hard work for the past 2 years as senior high school students. It is already a cliche that we hear that this is not the end, but a commencement, a beginning. And it is true. The pandemic seemed to have cleared off what we were used to before. That what comes after this crisis is what is new, the so-called new normal. It is consoling to consider this day a commencement because we want to begin anew, to rise above a situation where we were rendered powerless. Your batch had looked forward to so many beautiful things that would happen in the year when you are the senior batch, not only of the senior high school, but of the whole basic education department. You had passed in the middle of the school year, and in our previous experience, the days would move like the wind. And before you would know it, it would be graduation time. You are batch 2020, and the months of 2020 have not been kind to you. The Al volcano eruption, canceled classes, canceled concert, the coronavirus pandemic, the lockdown and community quarantine, more canceled classes, distance learning, no class picture, no graduation ball, no toga, no face-to-face graduation ceremonies. My, is this year really for you? To think that one of the joys our Bosconians always have is to march with their parents on graduation day. And all that is gone. One confer was sharing with me, another priest in our community, yesterday evening, our grade 12 students are graduating tomorrow without even having seen the school since March. There's reason to feel sad about it. And I myself share in that sorrow, for which father would want his children to leave home without even seeing them off and saying goodbye. It is one of the things that causes me pain right now, I was telling them. And situations like these, my dear friends, are difficult to understand. And so are what we are doing in school. Maybe teaching online, that is what Bible professors are doing, and then witnessing people getting depressed because of this. You know, there were many things. That's me in the picture carrying the Paschal candle. We were celebrating only as a small community because we could not celebrate outside. But there were these words: pandemic, lockdown, quarantine, frontliner, social distancing, asymptomatic contact tracing. We never used them so much before. And the word that somehow strikes us, very relevant for maybe the star of our convention, pandemic, here. It is the word of the year, according to many dictionaries, pandemic. Now, seeing this, what do I think about these experiences? And here we have a sum that would help us make sense of what we're experiencing. And so let's look at the text of Psalm 91. Here's the text from the original Hebrew, and then I translated it. And so here's my translation. I'll read it because much of what we will speak about pertain to this whole psalm. The one who dwells in the refuge of the Most High, who abides in the shade of the Almighty, will say to Adonai, my refuge and my stronghold, my God in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler, from the destroying pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will seek refuge. His faithfulness is shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, from the pestilence that walks in darkness, from the destruction that lays waste at noon. 1,000 will fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right. It will not draw near you. You will only look with your eyes, and you will see the retribution of the wicked. For you have made the Lord your refuge, the Most Highest dwelling place. No evil will befall you, and no plague will draw near your tent. For he has commanded his angel to watch over you, to guard you in all your ways. Upon their hands they will lift you up, that you may not dash your foot against a stone. You shall tread over the lion and the viper. You shall trample the young lion and the serpent. Since he clings to me in love, so I will deliver him. I will protect him, for he knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in distress. I will deliver him and honor him. With length of days, I will satisfy him, and I will show him my salvation. Let's look at the structure of Psalm 91. We have the first section, the first two verses. And here, what do we see? We see a confession of trust constituted in I style by someone in trouble who seeks from Adonai refuge, protection, and rescue. And then the second section, which is quite long, which spans verse 3 to verse 13. And the beginning is marked with the particle he. That could be translated as yes or for. Here it is. Okay. And then the personal pronoun who. Here is who. And the meaning of who is he. And it's clearly separated from the first by the difference in the direction of speech in contrast to verses 1 to 2, as you have seen it. The one who dwells in the refuge of the Most High, who abides, will say to Yahweh. And then the second one, for he will deliver you. That's a change in the direction. And then the addressee, who is now a thou, who in terms of the combination of motives can only be the speaker of verses 1 to 2. Verses 3 to 13, the whole of this, explain to this thou in the style of an authoritative promise of salvation. That and how Adonai will prove to be a refuge and protection for him or for her. And this part consists in turn of two analogously constructed subsections. These two, 1 and then 2. Okay? Two subsections. And that's verses 3 to 8 and 9 to 13. And the division is marked on the one hand by verse 9, in which the speaker repeats the confession that opens the psalm, this time as a quotation, and at the same time comments on it. On the other hand, the beginning and end of two subsections are set in parallel, and the sequence of the two subsections produces a dramatic heightening. And we go to the third section. And what do we find here? It's divine discourse in the I style and differs from the preceding section because this discourse is no longer addressed to thou, but shapes its promise of rescue in an I or he direction. In the translation, I've read it a while ago, no? After you shall tread over the lion and the viper. And then on verse 14, we see again, since he clings to me in love, so I will deliver him. So that shift. And the divine discourse could accordingly be either an internal dialogue for God, which is not very probable, because if you see the structure of events that underlies the psalm, or a public promise of salvation by God from a forum that is not clearly identified. What is the context of this? A promise that at the same time confirms the promise of salvation given by the speaker of the section that spans 3 to 13. What could be or what could have been the context of this psalm? Is it temple liturgy? Because if we see it, okay, there is the echo of temple motifs, okay? Temple motifs in the psalm, shifting voices or roles. It's like there's a soloist and chorus, much like the Greek tragedies, Greek theater. And there's a promise by a speaker to the petitioner, and it's on behalf of Adonai, and that can be called a divine speech. It points to a background for the psalm in the temple liturgy. Could it have been that? Opinions about whether the psalm was created as a liturgical agenda or as part of a liturgy, or whether it only imitates a liturgical ritual in literary form, differ. And the underlying ritual, it's variously imagined. What kind of ritual was it? Depending on one's cultic historical hypothesis. The beginning of the psalm is often altered by corrections to the text. So that may be a clue that maybe it must have been used for different purposes, and that's why the alteration of the first two verses. Now, there are some who connect the psalm directly or indirectly with the so-called portal liturgy, like remembering that we have this part, okay, like when you enter, for example, a sanctuary, so liturgy of the temple gate, and we find this also in Psalms 15, 24, 84, okay, and also 121. And thus, if we take this opinion, verses 1 to 2 would be a speech by pilgrims approaching the temple. And we do have that even in our own pilgrimages. Upon entering, then we say this, remember the Jubilee year. And then verses 3 to 13 is the promise of salvation to the pilgrims. And that is the priestly teaching. And we could picture it in this way. One of the priests interprets a visit to the temple as a saving and enduringly protective encounter with God. And then verses 14 to 16 would be the divine word itself, spoken from the sanctuary. So you see that? One who is there at the gate, okay? And then second, the priest, and then third, from the sanctuary, the divine word. The other one is, the other interpretation is, it could be a ceremony or a ceremony of blessing as a background for the psalm, especially since the psalm gives strong evidence of a double perspective of protection in the sanctuary and on the road. So these are the two positions, and the choice between these two is not really possible because we do not really know exactly how they go about with the temple liturgy, with those ceremonies. Now, similarly, it must remain open whether the psalm was created for a liturgical use or, as seems more probable to us, for private recitation in the temple, and especially outside the temple. Now, we see this psalm also as a psalm of trust sui generis. So in its own kind, a psalm of trust. And we see that the character of this psalm is one of promise. It does not only teach that Adonai saves, but someone is being promised that Adonai will rescue that person, and especially that person, only to the extent that this promise is ultimately given to all the devout. It's somewhat conditional. You who dwell, you who rest in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shade of the Almighty. That is the condition. That this promise is ultimately given to all the devout, and that the psalm thus contains a fundamental statement. Does it have a didactic character? And thus, one can call this, as I said, a psalm of trust sui generis, with which, in the face of multiple current and structural threats to one's life, maybe somebody constantly living in danger, the psalm combines the various aspects of the classic crisis situation of danger from enemies or persecution and sickness and death. One prays oneself into the hope, indeed, the certainty that one is protected and gifted with life by Adonai. And with this psalm, in imitation of a cultic or sacramental action, the petitioner receives, through the voice of the authoritative speaker for God, verses 3 to 13, and ultimately from the voice of God's own self, the divine voice there in verses 14 to 16, both rescue and life. In a sense, this psalm invites one to experience what the petitioner had explicitly formulated in verse 2. Will say to Yahweh or Adonai, my refuge and my stronghold, my God in whom I trust. And as a literary staging of an originally cultic ritual, the psalm does not require a number of roles for its recitation. The petitioner himself or herself plays the three voices of the psalm. And so in reciting the psalm, as how we do it, when we read it personally, the petitioner constitutes the saving counterworld, that salvation as projected in the psalm, against the threatening world in which he lives. Let's look at this, the hunter's snare and pestilence. And we have these two words, pach, that's snare or trap, and then dever. And let's look at these two words, okay? When we read the psalm, Kihu Yetzilcha Mipach Yakush Midever Abot, for he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler, from the destroying pestilence. And we see for the first word, Pach, and here is where you see it, there, okay? Pach. You could say that it's a bird trap, okay? And then it is used metaphorically in a number of senses. And then usually it is used figuratively when snare refers to calamities and plots. So very much related to pestilence, okay? Calamities, or maybe even the plottings of villains. And so we use it not only in the sense of bird trap, and here in we also see a nuance of it. It could be referred to. It could refer to the source or agent of calamity himself, the pach. Okay. So bird trap, literally, it is usually used figuratively. So what we said, calamities and plots. In fact, the word pach is the source of agent or calamity sometimes, and the verb is pacha, an ensnaring. Now, going to the culture in those times. Of all the varieties of the hunt, only fishing and fowling were still widely pursued in historical times. It's not the big game hunting where they shoot these big animals. Okay, unlike that one, these activities were still relatively profitable and could be managed without the benefit of sophisticated weapons or the use of horses. Whereas the bow and arrow were weapons characteristic of the aristocracy and symbolic of the king's far-reaching power, the tools of the ordinary hunter were nets and traps. It's what you would see, what you see in our slides. While they were used to capture large game like gazelle, they were most commonly employed for catching fish and birds. Now, it is the bird traps, for example, that the Hebrew terms for trap, mokesh, and pach invariably refer. The use of nets was among the oldest and most widespread hunting techniques. The snaring of birds and fish is frequently depicted in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian art. Indeed, the very word of hunting in Sumerian, nigin, is graphically represented by the ideogram for net. But no matter how widely practiced, even those most common forms of hunting contributed only marginally to most ancient economies, all of which were dominated by the exploitation of domestic plants and animals. Pach, okay? When we speak about the snare of the fowler, we say that we are lowly and helpless creatures. We are small time, and yet we are being hunted. Our agility may be apparent, but we are limited. Let's go to dever, and here's the word, okay? Meaning pestilence. Okay, primarily pestilence, it could be plague, pestilence, okay? And then also, more specifically, what kind of plague? Cattle plague or murrain, okay? An adopted, a French word that's adopted in English. So we have a note here, the fowler's trap, okay, the fowler's snare, and the threat of destruction in verse 3, okay, they're specifically defined, okay? The language is metaphorical for all kinds of traps and threats from enemies and from natural causes. That's why we can put them together, the pach and the dever. The threat of destruction probably refers primarily to slander and vocal threats of the enemies. So you see that when you hear those words against you, though dever can mean anything or everything, everything or something. In fact, here it's there are no vowels. What is the first thing that you could recognize? Dabar, okay, word. Or if you go to Israel now, even in those times, it's something very common. When I was studying Hebrew for the first time, dabar, no, that's a very sacred term, word. But then when you go to Israel, deber, it could mean anything, like the rest of Latin. It could be just anything, something. And so it's very generic. So the expression may mean something, may mean simply anything that destroys. And so it found itself as dever. Okay? Now, this plague is in the sense of destroying, for it comes from a primitive root. Okay, that's dalet, beth, and resh. This root probably originally meant to arrange, but this is used figuratively of words to speak, rarely, in a destructive sense, to subdue, answer, appoint, bid, command, commune, declare, destroy, give, name, promise, pronounce, rehearse, say, speak, be a spokesman, subdue, talk, teach, tell, think, use entreaties, utter, speak well. So a lot of use for this root from where dever comes. Now, we also speak of dever, when we speak of dever, it reminds us of epidemics. And the variety of epidemics are mentioned in the Old Testament. And thus, the description in Zechariah 14:12 is very reminiscent of Asiatic cholera, although there's no reliable evidence of this disease in epidemic form before the 19th century. Okay, just a background, no? And the derivation of a Hebrew word referring to contagious epidemic disease of devastating proportions. Pestilence is never portrayed in the Bible as an aimless, naturally occurring phenomenon that it just came from anywhere, okay, without any aim. It is always regarded as a judgment or punishment sent by God. Only once is it used to denote a disease of cattle, and therefore, in that part, in the King James Version, it translates that word in Exodus 90 as murrain. So pestilence was one form of chastisement which was to be brought upon Israel for neglect of her covenant obligations. This is the reason for the frequent use of the word by both Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And these prophets were prosecuting God's covenant lawsuit against his people. The sentence had been determined, and they announced that its infliction was impending. For this reason, pestilence almost occurs as part of a list of scourges, such as the formula of sword, famine, and pestilence used throughout Jeremiah's prophecy. Because pestilence is a punishment for sin, it is not applied indiscriminately upon all. The one who remains faithful will be protected from all its effects. The enemies of Israel could also be objects of this form of judgment. Pestilence is not identical with plague in the Old Testament. Why? Plague often denotes such diseases as bubonic plague, measles, smallpox, whereas pestilence might refer to cholera, typhus, typhoid, and dysentery. Diseases often inflicting a city under siege. And there's some overlap in terms, however. Because pestilence is a punishment for sin, it is not applied indiscriminately upon all. The one who remains faithful will be protected from its effects. And that is what we see in Psalm 91, verses 1 to 3. The enemies of Israel could also be objects of this form of judgment. Now, I continue this part, okay? I think that's one of the slides. The death of 70,000 Israelites after David's census is an example of the severity and virulence of this form of divine chastisement. How about the Greek word? The Greek word is loimos, and it occurs, if we look at the New Testament, it occurs 3 times. In Acts 24:5, Tertullus used this term as a derogatory description of Paul. He calls Paul a pestilent fellow. Jesus predicted that the destruction of the temple would be preceded by several judgments, including pestilence or plague. Okay? So let's look at this part. The subsequent subsection, verses 3 to 8, begins with an image from the avian world, okay? From the point of view of looking at birds. It plays on the dangers that threaten birds, especially young birds, in the form of fowlers and raptors. And the fowlers lay out traps and nets or shoot at the birds with arrows tipped with deadly thorns. And the birds themselves cannot protect or save themselves from these dangers unless someone releases the trapped birds or renders the fowler's traps and arrows harmless. And the most effective protection for the young birds are the powerful pinions and sheltering wings of the mother bird. See that? And we find that now in the psalm and in the songs patterned after, under his wings your refuge, because the mother bird offers her young a secure place of refuge. Now let's go to this last part, choosing. And this is our conclusion, Psalm 91 in the time of pandemic. This will not be very long, but I just have some takeaways from Psalm 91. 1, the relationships. The dramatis personae is a threesome. The psalmist refers to the Lord in different ways. Elyon, the Most High, Shaddai, Almighty, Yahweh or Adonai, and then Elohai, my God. The lowly one finds power in the Lord. It is a relationship of trust. The Lord is in relation to the mortal. Who dwells in the Lord? Who abides in him? And what does God do? He will deliver the mortal from the snare and pestilence and all that is like them. And we see in this psalm a triangle of dramatis personae. The Lord, and then the mortal who depends on him, and the third party, the foil or antagonist of the duo. This is expressed in the synonyms: the snare of the fowler, deadly pestilence, terror of the night, arrow that flies by day, pestilence that stalks in darkness, destruction that wastes at noonday, people falling all over, recompense of the wicked, evil scourge, all of those. But what will protect the two from the others? That He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, if you dwell in the Lord, and He becomes your refuge. And then second, Psalm 91 comes alive in the pandemic. And you would see this in the internet, a lot referring to Psalm 91 because we have the pandemic. The praying of the psalm does not discount the fact that we are in the midst of the pandemic. It is precisely because of our situation that we find meaning in prayer. And we remember biblical hermeneutics with Gadamer. Understanding happens when our present understanding or horizon is moved to a new understanding or horizon by an encounter. And when we read something, the page becomes alive. The psalm has thus become a staple of general use. When we share in the suffering of the psalmist, when we say that, when we read the psalms, we identify with that, we feel that. We can always pray the psalms taking on empathy for those who actually experience snares and pestilence. So when we were reading this, even if you do not have the experience of pestilence, that experience is brought to you. However, now it's different, it's stronger. Now, we not only see the ordeal of the psalmist from a vicarious point of view. We ourselves have experienced pestilence, and we're still experiencing it now. Going back to Gadamer on the fusion of two horizons, the horizon of the psalmist and of us who are afflicted have become identified. This one we see as responsory on Ash Wednesday morning. God Himself will set me free from the hunter's snare. Wow, this is our title for this convention. And then from those who would entrap me with lying words, and from the hunter's snare. See, it is here. Okay? I've read this recently from the internet because they were discussing the word of the year, which is pandemic. So what is the pandemic? Okay, when we see it, we see life upended. A lot of change in our lives, and you see that. That's our common experience, albeit in different forms. But there's one that has caused all of this, the pandemic. But not only is life upended, language has transformed. Before we looked at words, they did not mean anything to us. And we read this, how rare it is for the origin of the word, with pandemic ultimately coming from the Greek pan, all, and demos, people. Okay? So we see that part. Okay? Now, in what way does it affect us? Okay? So rarely we see that one. Okay? That pandemic. Okay? Pan and then demos. Now we see that pandemic has become so literal. And without a doubt, the pandemic affected all of us, all of the world, in nearly all aspects of our lives. Okay? And so, look at these words. Okay? Pandemic, lockdown, okay? Quarantine, frontliner, social distancing, asymptomatic contact tracing. Before, they did not mean anything to us. Now, oh, we see them. They have sense, a different sense. They have changed before us. And my dear friends, I'd like to end with this. Before, Psalm 91 may have been meaningful for us, but now even its meaning has changed for us. It has become stronger, that bond between us and the psalmist. And what does it bring us? Since there was that trust, I go back to the talk of Father Randy when he spoke about hope. This one also speaks about hope. If you have somebody who can be your refuge, that gives hope. And, you know, when we speak about that, the plague, the pestilence, the pandemic that we have now, and then it's connected to the snare, the hunter's snare. What could be that snare? Maybe it could happen even during this pandemic. The snare could be the temptation to despair, could be that trap. But as what Gabriel Marcel would say, he would say that there can be no hope. On un pour l'espérance sans la tentation to desespoir, okay, if I remember it right. So there can be no hope without that temptation to despair. And so when it comes, we continue hoping. I end with these thoughts, no? Rabindranath Tagore would say, day by day thou art making me worthy of the simple great gifts thou gavest to me unasked. The sky and the light, this body and the life and the mind, saving me from perils of overmuch desire. And that is what we experience in the pandemic. We go with the barest essentials, that we do not desire too much, because that one is enough, what we receive from the Lord. And Marie Curie would say, nothing in this life is to be, nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less. Psalm 91 would help us understand better, especially in our times. And I end with these words by Saint Teresa of Jesus. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God never changes. The star of Psalm 91. Patience reaches everything. Whoever has God wants nothing. God alone suffices. And with that, I end. Thank you very much for listening, and may God bless you all.